When I talk about video games, I almost always do it from the player's perspective, for obvious reasons. I mean, this is what most YouTubers do, right? The fact is that we are players, and it's natural to share our own subjective experience with games. As a kid, when I was first playing the Prime games, I didn't spend much time trying to dissect their design. I just had a blast playing them, and I hope these videos have been able to convey that sense of wonder they gave me. But if the major goal of this series of videos is to understand why the games in the series are so different from each other, why they join together as parts of a trilogy in such an awkward and uncomfortable way, that involves getting outside my own childhood experience and trying to see these games from the perspective of the people who made them. Every game developer is trying to accomplish something when it makes a game, even if it's just make money. In the case of the Prime trilogy, though, I think this motivation was much more than financial. I think that the developers of the Prime trilogy were driven by a sense of ambition that made them want to experiment and innovate. I believe that they took a great deal of pride in their work and felt that, as good as the Metroid franchise already had been, they could do better, not only by making a more exciting and mechanically rich game, but also by engaging the player on an emotional level. This is a strong statement, but I have evidence for it, and it's not necessarily what you might imagine. My primary reason for feeling this way isn't anything I've seen in the design of the game proper, or anything I've heard the developers say about making the series. It's actually a lot more niche than that. It's concept art. Now, practically every video game has concept art. It's an essential part of the process of design, and in most cases, that's all it is. It's not a product on its own. But in Metroid Prime's case, concept art is one of the bonus features you get access to by scanning a certain number of points of interest or acquiring a certain number of upgrades. Bonus features, or unlockables as they're often called, comprise an aspect of game design that often gets overlooked by critics. But I would argue that they have a lot to say about the personality of the developer. They hint at it in a way that other parts of the game generally don't. During the campaign, or what most people think of as the actual game, personal interests and quirks often get buried beneath more general rules of good design and the need to tell a coherent, engaging story. It's only when the game is over and the fourth wall no longer needs to be maintained that they can afford to let loose and be themselves. Ironically, they can speak to the audience most directly only when they're done talking, so to speak. If you've ever played a Kirby game, chances are that you know what a sound test is. Almost every major Kirby game has one, and it's no coincidence that most Kirby games have kick-ass music. The fact that the people at HAL take music seriously is something you could figure out by listening closely to the soundtrack while you're playing and appreciating its complexity and polish. Or you could figure it out from the fact that they let you listen to any track anytime as a bonus feature. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. It means something that sound tests are so essential to Kirby, especially because most games don't have them. You know what else most games don't have? Concept art galleries. In fact, I've played at least a dozen non-Kirby games that had a sound test in them, but I can't even think of a game outside the Metroid Prime series that has an unlockable concept art gallery. Unless you count Luigi's Mansion. But the ghost paintings aren't technically concept art.
I mean, sure, they're art, and they're kind of conceptual, and you unlock them. But they weren't used to design the characters. I mean, it's pretty obvious this is finished art that's inside a finished game, rather than concept art used to make the game, you know?
It's a debatable point. Anyway, it's obvious from looking at these galleries that the people at Retro Studios were in love with art design. This concept art is gorgeous. It's moody and evocative and engrossing, just like the games it was made for. There must be a reason why Retro spent so much time making it, and then presented it to the player with such fanfare. You have to remember that the original Metroid Prime came out at a time when there was virtually no mass-market interest in video game concept art. It wasn't like today, when practically every AAA game launches with a lavishly printed art book full of watercolory backgrounds and glossy airbrushed enemy models. Most concept art back then wasn't accessible in any form except to the people who actually used it at the company where it was created. But from the very beginning, there was something different about Retro. Not just different from the previous developers of Metroid, but different from most game studios. And I would say that difference was ambition. It takes ambition to bring a classic 2D franchise into 3D. It takes guts to introduce a mountain of lore into a series which previously had virtually no on-screen text and no NPCs. And it takes an unbelievable amount of chutzpah to start your game design career with an epic trilogy. But of course, the Prime series wasn't really an epic trilogy. The original Prime retained a lot of the detached, unemotional feel of earlier Metroid games. This was and is considered a major accomplishment by many people. It still feels like Metroid, but for storytelling purposes, it's kind of a bad fit. Echoes was more dramatic and intense, and it would have worked wonderfully as the middle part of a trilogy, if its plot had had more than a smidgen of relevance to the events of the other two games, which it didn't. Prime had the right story approach, but the wrong tone. Echoes fixed the tone, but left the story in limbo. This left Corruption with a very tall order to fill. It basically had to recap all the events of Metroid Prime with more drama, while also tying in echoes as much as possible, and taking the story somewhere new and interesting for the finale. Corruption is only 1/3 of the trilogy, but it ended up shouldering more than half of the burden of exposition and storytelling. I think Retro did an amazing job under the circumstances, but there is simply no way that Corruption could withstand this intense pressure without being warped and twisted into a different kind of experience from what Metroid fans were used to. In order to finish this underdeveloped trilogy, Corruption took a huge risk by making a deal with the devil of sorts. It made Metroid a much more story-heavy, linear, and set-piece-oriented experience, alienating many of the series' biggest fans in the process. In other words, Metroid Prime Corruption went hyper. Corruption's change in direction was evident from the very start. In both Prime and Echoes, the first half-hour of gameplay is a very dark and somber experience, with Samus traveling completely alone through the ruins of a wrecked starship and a destroyed GF base, both of which have more corpses in them than living inhabitants. Corruption, on the other hand, starts you out on a fully operational Galactic Federation battleship full of Marines and engineers walking around doing their jobs. They're not terribly friendly, but all of them are at least able and willing to talk to you, if only for a moment. Prime had no friendly NPCs at all, and Echoes arguably had a total of 4 friendly NPCs who talk to you over the course of the whole game. Here, on the other hand, you'll speak to a minimum of a dozen people before you fight a single enemy. This has the unfortunate side effect of making the opening sequence feel pretty dry and even boring, especially on repeat playthroughs, but it exists for a reason. In this section, you're introduced to 3 other bounty hunters whose actions will end up defining the structure of the rest of the game: Rundas, Ghor, and Gandrayda. These are not terribly well fleshed out characters. In fact, they're pretty one-note, but they are characters, and they end up having a huge influence on Corruption's story. If anything, I would actually say that Corruption's biggest flaw is that it doesn't spend enough time establishing Samus's relationships with the other hunters. It cuts the necessary exposition down to a bare minimum, and actually gets to the action fairly quickly. In a little more than an hour, Corruption establishes the existence of Aurora units, the current state of the conflict between the space pirates and the GF, the existence of other bounty hunters and a little bit about their personalities, the GF's new Phazon weapons program, and the reappearance of Dark Samus. These are all major plot points that pay off substantially later on in the story, and it's almost incredible how efficiently the game gets through each one, though the resulting pace is so brisk it risks being confusing. Personally, I would have appreciated a little more dialogue to set things up before things started blowing up. But unfortunately, even the quickest exposition in the world was not going to come across well to fans of this series. Metroid fans were used to being thrown into the thick of things not quickly, but immediately, and so this was the first point where a lot of old-school players started to shake their heads. The fundamental issue here is the question of what meaning game design elements like level structure or the critical upgrade path are supposed to have. Previous Metroid games primarily designed these elements to act like clues to a big puzzle. Corruption, by contrast, generally uses them to set up dramatic and emotional moments in the game world, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but not something that people were used to seeing a Metroid game do. Another thing that probably annoys people here is that Samus is confronted with a situation that the game explicitly states she can't deal with on her own. In this introductory sequence, Samus is protected from danger 5 times by somebody else, twice by Rundas, once each by the other 2 bounty hunters, and once by an ordinary GF soldier using Phazon-enhanced weaponry. In at least 2 of these situations, it's pretty clear that Samus would have died without the other person's help. She's not presented as emotionally weak, the way she later would be in Other M, but Corruption deliberately raises the stakes to a level where Samus on her own can't cope. Depending on how you look at things, this is either Corruption's greatest strength, or its biggest flaw. I like the sense of teamwork and camaraderie that Samus develops with the other hunters, and I think it's realistic that at this stage of the war against Phazon, things would be so out of control that the Federation would need to use everything at its disposal. And yet, without changing Samus's character at all, this kind of story makes her seem smaller and less important, which is something a lot of fans find irritating. Twilight Princess did something very similar to Link only a year before this, and just like Corruption, it faced a lot of controversy for doing it. Twilight Princess is one of my favorite games, by the way. Mark began his video on Corruption by saying that the game couldn't decide whether it wanted to be open and player-driven like Super Metroid, or linear and plot-driven like Metroid Fusion. That's a pretty harsh way of saying that it doesn't fit neatly into either category, and honestly, I think he's wrong. Corruption doesn't half-ass its approach to linearity versus player freedom. It quite deliberately alternates between giving you one and the other. There's an important reason for the relative lack of free exploration, which is that the game has a story to tell and needs to give you some direction in order to tell it. That's not indecision. It's more like making a decision that some people didn't like. And speaking of things some people didn't like, let's take a look at the first section of the game proper. Bryyo is one of the strangest and most inconsistently designed areas in the whole Prime trilogy. Superficially, it seems to have more in common with previous games than any other region in Corruption. It's a lush planet teeming with life and characterized by extremes of hot and cold, a lot like Talon 4 from Prime. Also, the largest area on the planet, and the first you explore, Cliffside, gives you a lot of room to explore and find upgrades, free of nagging story details and interruptions from the Aurora unit. Well, mostly free, anyway. But this initial impression is deceptive. In fact, Bryyo is not only the most artificially split up of the planets in Corruption, it's also the one which has the most contrived and arguably least Metroid-y level design. This is particularly noticeable in the Thorn Jungle, which is nothing but an extended gauntlet of combat challenges that tests everything about the player, patience, thumb flexibility, resistance to suicidal thoughts, except your brain. It's one of the few parts of Corruption that I consider legitimately terrible, and in my opinion it's the nadir of the game. Fiery, the other small area on Bryyo, is better, but it's also dominated by set pieces, in this case a mixture of combat and simple puzzles. None of the puzzles is as interesting as even an average puzzle on any other planet, and while combat in Corruption is more exciting than it's ever been in a Prime game, fighting multiple enemies is still more of a drag than an interesting challenge, especially those obnoxious teleporting fire dogs. Corruption's free aiming system and its heavy emphasis on using hyper mode work best in encounters against a single powerful enemy. The boss fights allow you to do some really cool things with precise aiming, and the tension of alternating between regular attacks to stun and switching to hyper mode to batter the boss with damage is fun for the most part. You can also go into hyper mode to stun the bosses too, if you're incredibly confident or have a death wish. But the game also pushes you into using hyper mode against regular enemies all the time, and since you use up an energy tank every time you do, it's hard to escape the feeling that the game is making you waste your health and take an excessive amount of risk. Hyper mode would feel better to use as a tool if it were one of several similarly effective tools for combat. Instead, it often feels like hyper mode is your hammer, and all of your enemies happen to be tough as nails unless you use it. I think this is another example of the game's story goals conflicting with player comfort. Corruption wants you to rely on hyper mode because so much of the story hinges on the drama of Phazon corruption. You're supposed to feel like you're being pushed to use it, because that reflects the way Samus is being inexorably drawn into the net set up by Dark Samus at the beginning of the game. But the result is a game that feels like there's only one correct way to play it, and if you stubbornly try to use your normal weapons, then far too many combat sections turn into frustrating slogs. One combat encounter I do like, however, is the boss fight against Rundas. It's a simple introduction to the stun and punish tactics that characterize most of Corruption's boss fights, but there's a lot of variety in his attacks, and he isn't frustratingly cheap the way some later bosses are. The simple nature of Rundas' fight matches his character very well. When he's first introduced, Rundas comes across as a sort of easygoing meathead, a good-natured guy, but also a little naive. In the opening sequence on Norion, he saves Samus' life twice, both times in a very flashy and dramatic way, and he's the only one who talks to Samus as if the two of them are actually friends and teammates. It's worth noting that of the 3 generators that need activating, Samus takes care of 2 of them, and Rundas hits the other one. In fact, it's pretty weird how often Samus and Rundas keep bumping into each other during the mission, while Ghor and Gandrayda seem like they're on a different planet for most of it. Possibly because of the early encounter with him, Rundas seems to have been changed the least by the Phazon corruption. He doesn't do anything to hinder Samus' efforts before they fight, and even during the fight, he starts by killing the space pirates around her. What I like about this little detail is that there's multiple ways to interpret it. Is this one last vestige of Rundas' good nature, battling with the influence of Phazon? Is he doing it out of a sense of pride, because he wants to fight Samus one-on-one? Or has he gone so completely bonkers that he indiscriminately attacks anything he sees? Actually, now that I think about it, given all those frozen animals scattered over the rest of Bryyo, the third explanation probably makes the most sense. It's on the second planet you visit during Corruption's campaign that a lot of the quirky design aspects actually start to pay off. Skytown is basically a huge mechanical fortress with ancient Chozo contraptions scattered all over the place, and the upgrades you acquire here let you manipulate these machines in half a dozen different ways. At its best, this part of the game actually makes the motion controls feel immersive. It certainly does a better job of this than practically every other game on the Wii. I don't have a lot of fond memories of my time spent on Bryyo, but when I think back to Elysia, my mind immediately jumps to these little mechanical moments. Welding circuit boards together, soaring through the air on a skyline, blasting out of those weird crossbow cannon things, and especially using the screw attack. I think I mentioned in the last video that Echo's implementation of the screw attack is one of the best adaptations of a 2D mechanic into 3D that I've ever seen. Corruption takes the same approach with it, but gives you much bigger distances to boost across. The screw attack was made for Skytown, or maybe it would be more accurate to say that Skytown was made for the screw attack. Watching Samus cover these immense open spaces is just hypnotically fascinating to me, and I never get tired of it. You know you're having a good time in a video game when you find yourself using a particular ability over and over again, even in areas where it has no specific function, just because you enjoy doing it. Anyway, the lore you find in Skytown is a bit of a letdown compared with Bryyo, but that's okay because the actual plot here is more substantial. Unlike Rundas, who apparently just wandered around picking his nose before he ran into you on Bryyo, Ghor recognizes your presence on Elysia right away and starts taking measures to thwart you. First, he cripples the Aurora unit with his plasma beam before you can bring it back online, and then, after taunting you a little, he makes it personal by hunting down your ship and beating 6 kinds of snot out of it. I really like the build-up that this particular part of the story has. You run across Ghor's armor suit before you ever see him in person, and it's a little intimidating because you've seen how powerful he is with it on before, but at the same time, he's not in it now, right? And when he confronts you in the Aurora unit chamber, it's believable that he would run away instead of trying to finish you off, because he's clearly much weaker than Samus without his suit on. The design of his character and the details of the story mesh together here really well. Ghor is also a deeper and more interesting character than Rundas. At first you might think he's a robot, but in fact he's a cyborg, and it looks like that little red bit on his head is actually his brain, the one remaining piece of his original body that's left. Basically, he's a sci-fi version of the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz. Before the Phazon corruption, Ghor comes across as the most thoughtful and reserved of the hunters. He doesn't speak out of turn like Rundas, and he doesn't play games like Gandrayda. The one moment when he seems to come out of his shell is while talking to the Aurora unit, an organic supercomputer that probably interests him particularly because it, like him, is part living tissue and part machine. Oh, and also I guess while he's wearing his armor suit, which canonically makes him go full-on psychotic regardless of his current level of Phazon intoxication. But I digress. Samus seems equally upset at the deaths of Rundas and Ghor, but the way the story is set up, it seems like this is for different reasons. Rundas treated her like a friend and saved her life, and you get the feeling that her sorrow over his death is personal. But Ghor doesn't seem like the kind of person who makes friends. Here I get a stronger feeling that Samus is reacting to seeing what this formerly brilliant bounty hunter has been reduced to. It's not so much sorrow for Ghor as the haunting realization that even the best and brightest aren't safe from the lure of Phazon. But after you take down Ghor, there's still a lot of Skytown left to be explored, and it includes some of the best parts of Corruption. Mark didn't talk much about the second half of Skytown in his video, and I think that's a real shame because this part of the game contains what I think is the single scariest and most oppressively atmospheric moment in the series, exploring the Space Pirate Research Lab where Samus is once again reintroduced to Metroids. This lab consists of just 2 large maze-like rooms full of Metroids inside storage pods, and on the way in, there is literally nothing that can hurt you. Even after you take out the energy cell that lets you access the Seeker Missile upgrade, you barely run into any Metroids until you're already halfway back to safety, and you don't actually have to destroy any of them in order to get out. Replaying this section recently, I was amazed at how little danger you actually face during this section, because when I first played it, I was in a state of absolute panic. The game accomplishes this not with challenge, but solely with its atmosphere. The music is creepy but understated, never bombastic, and the design of the 2 rooms lulls you into not consulting the map, even though that's the best way to figure out how to get out. Escaping the lab requires using the Seeker missiles, which is a fiddly kind of mechanic that you're bound to screw up at least once. And every time you do, your heart skips a beat, because you just know there's a Metroid right behind you, and in this game they can phase through the walls and the floors and your attacks, plus they can hit you from across the room with force lightning, plus you have to remember that in this game it's your missiles that freeze things, and you have to use your beam after your missiles, and not the other way around, and while you're worrying about all this, your ability to do something as basic as read a map is just shot to hell. This is something I've rarely seen a game manage to do. Corruption isn't presenting you with an incredibly tough challenge here. It's throwing you a meatball and then scaring you into forgetting how to swing a bat. I think it's genius, and it works on you no matter how good of a player you are. But now that I think about it, that's probably a reason for a lot of old-school Metroid fans to dislike it. One thing Mark actually did talk about in this section was the defense of the Spire Bomb right before you reach the boss. And here, to be honest, I mostly agree with him. This does feel a lot like Halo and other FPSs, and the first time I played this section I did horribly at it and had a miserable time. On my latest playthrough I did much better, and I think this is because I finally reconciled myself to Corruption's preferred combat strategy. Go into hyper mode as much as you possibly can, and use separate shots instead of the charged machine gun style shot. I have to say that this is one aspect of the design of hyper mode that completely bewilders me. After every boss you get a new Phazon-infused attack, but every single one of them is less effective overall than your basic uncharged beam. Hyper missiles use up way too much of your Phazon. 2 of them can drain an entire energy tank's worth. Hyper voltage barely does any damage, and the hyper ball... Do I even have to explain why going into the morph ball during hyper mode is usually a really bad idea? What's frustrating about hyper mode is that it hypothetically gives you more options in combat, but in practice you have to use it all the time to the exclusion of other options, and the best way to use it is also the most boring. Hyper missiles are so wasteful that I never use them, which is a drag because it means that after a certain point you have nothing to do with your hundreds of missiles that you went out of your way to collect expansions for. There has never been another Metroid game where missiles are this useless, and given that they're one of the primary motivations for thoroughly exploring the map, this is a pretty serious problem. With the 2 Leviathans in Federation space taken care of, Samus is finally ready to confront the space pirates on their own turf, using coordinates provided by Gandrayda in her last message before succumbing to the Corruption. This is in many ways the darkest chapter of Corruption's story, if not the scariest. The pirate homeworld is grimy and ugly, a landscape of old rusted-out industrial equipment under a leaden sky which constantly drizzles acid rain onto the surface. Elysia, despite having a color scheme consisting mostly of various shades of brown, often managed to look quite pleasant and serene, but the pirate homeworld is somehow garish and dull at the same time. Much like the 2 pirate strongholds in the original Metroid Prime, this area can be divided into 2 very distinct feeling sections of gameplay. The one before the pirates notice Samus's presence, and the one after they start fighting back in force. In the first section, which lasts roughly up to the point where Samus goes back to Elysia to get the spider ball, the pirate homeworld has a heavy focus on puzzles and unlocking shortcuts. The second features near-constant battles against large numbers of powerful pirates, except for a very brief reprieve while Samus pokes around the mining site for the Nova Beam. But at first, the pirate homeworld is actually quite laid back, and even starts to feel like the original Prime for a while. It's not until Samus gets a distress call from a captured GF trooper and rushes to his aid that the pace starts to pick up again. Of course, you might wonder how an ordinary scrub soldier would be able to survive on his own for a month in a place where there's no food and the sky is full of acid. So yeah, to possibly no one's surprise, this is not actually a GF trooper. It's Gandrayda trying to lead you into an ambush. This is a pretty well set up twist, whether the player falls for it or not, and I like it. Corruption not only establishes Gandrayda as a shapeshifter from the moment she appears on screen, it also shows her using exactly the same trick against the pirates on Norion that she uses here on you. And in the end, it doesn't really work out the way she planned. Samus smells a rat just in time and narrowly avoids being shot in the back before the 2 hunters face off. Gandrayda is the most enigmatic of the hunters in Corruption. Even her employers at the Federation know virtually nothing about her except that she can transform. They don't even really know what planet she comes from. Judging by her dialogue at the beginning of the game, which is really all anyone has to go by, she comes across as arrogant and eager to show off, but also finicky about working too hard when she doesn't have to. She's the only hunter to have a generator completely under control and still not bother bringing it online because Samus is there to do it for her. One of the strangest things about Gandrayda is that even after her ruse is discovered, she doesn't seem the slightest bit concerned or apprehensive about fighting Samus. Even while you're fighting, there's a distinct sense that she's not taking you seriously, while she dances around the battlefield laughing and throwing a few potshots at you in between her more serious and deadly attacks. It kind of reminds me of the way Phaaze is characterized in Dragon Ball Z. It's like she's so self-confident that she doesn't see any need to exert herself even when she's fighting for her life. This is one of the greatest benefits of Corruption's approach to storytelling. By establishing characters who you later fight as bosses, it makes these fights feel unique in a way that Metroid never could before. The first 2 Metroid Prime games have a lot of high points, but I don't really consider any of them to be boss encounters, except for Metroid Prime at the end of the first game, which, not coincidentally in my opinion, is a fight against a character who has some backstory. When I think about great moments in Corruption, my mind doesn't go back to Moganar, Helios, or even Omega Ridley. These are certainly challenging fights, almost frustratingly so sometimes, but I don't find them memorable. What comes to mind is the fights against Rundas, Ghor, and Gandrayda, because not only is there a lot of variety within them, but they also have some meaning that extends beyond the boundaries of the boss encounter itself. In any case, when Gandrayda finally dies, Samus seems a bit less moved than she did for Rundas and Ghor. Her reaction is more shock at seeing her own face staring back at her during Gandrayda's final death throes than anything else. I mean, I can hardly blame her. It's not like Gandrayda was the galaxy's greatest co-worker. This is the cue for Samus to head back to Elysia and find the Spider Ball, which allows her to finally reach the Hazard Shield and the final, action-heavy part of the pirate homeworld. This is the climax of the game, where the pirates pull out all the stops to protect the last seed, and the Federation risks its whole fleet trying to help Samus destroy it. Sort of a Battle of the Pelennor Fields for Metroid, if you'll pardon the incredibly dorky reference. It probably goes without saying that it's this part of the campaign, and particularly the final push through what looks like a bunch of old train station platforms, that earns the most scorn from old-school Metroid fans. Not only does Samus have to babysit a bunch of GF engineers who rush ahead of her, even though their armor might as well be made of tin cans for all the protection it gives, but even disregarding that aspect of the sequence, it's basically just a long, protracted slog through a bunch of damaged sponge enemies who don't do anything interesting or new to shake things up. It's here that Corruption truly descends to the level of a generic sci-fi themed FPS, and the only saving grace I can think of for this section is that at least they only do it once, and you can let the majority of your loyal team of Smurfs die without any serious repercussions. Saving them all, on the other hand, is a truly thankless task that I've never managed to do, and it makes me appreciate the fact that my Wii was never hooked up to the internet, so the friend voucher I would have gotten for it is totally worthless anyway. However, having passed through what is arguably the most tedious part of Corruption, we can now move on to what I would argue is the most interesting part of Corruption, the living, sentient planet which is the source of all Phazon, the ultimate antagonist, in a sense, of the whole trilogy. Before we talk about the ending proper, let's take a brief look at the preview that Corruption gives you of it, the derelict GFS Valhalla. There's something very strange and unsettling about the Valhalla, and it's not the fact that it's dark and creepy and full of dead bodies. That's nothing new for Metroid, and especially not for the Metroid Prime trilogy, which has already thrown the player into both a wrecked spaceship and the remains of a wrecked GF base. No, what's really bizarre about the Valhalla is the enemies you fight in it, which are almost all either heavily mutated by Phazon, or actually are Phazon that has somehow come to life. By the endgame of Corruption, Samus has encountered a number of weird Phazon creatures, like the Metroid Hatchers, who completely bypass normal Metroid evolution, and the spherical, ray-emitting Phazoids, who pop up on worlds where a Leviathan seed has recently been destroyed. But this only happens on a planet thoroughly soaked in Phazon, and while some pretty terrible things happened on board the Valhalla, the pirates didn't leave a Leviathan behind on it. But there is an explanation. One of the pirate logs mentions that when Dark Samus first took over the pirates, she opened a wormhole in space and brought a Leviathan battleship through it, and the pirates used this to take the Valhalla. What must have happened is that a few organisms from wherever the Leviathans come from hopped aboard, and then moved onto the Federation ship after it was attacked. So in a way, the Valhalla serves as foreshadowing for the true nature of Planet Phaaze, just like the surreal environment inside each Leviathan seed. It does this not just aesthetically, but also mechanically, because fighting these creatures on the Valhalla teaches you some things that come in very handy once the stakes get raised in the endgame. As you may already know, when Samus lands on Phaaze, the massive levels of Phazon overload her suit so completely that she's forced to vent all her life energy through the PED to prevent immediate corruption. From that point on, she's in hyper mode permanently, and a glowing yellow corruption meter inexorably ticks upward, counting away the seconds until she succumbs. Phaaze is not an area you can breeze through. It's much smaller than the other planets, but it's longer than any other endgame area in Metroid history. Also, unlike in the rest of the game, constant shooting here will not reduce your Phazon level. All this does is marginally slow down its rate of increase. There are several methods of reducing this level, but they make you think a little outside the box. My favorite option they give you involves an enemy which the player has almost certainly fought on the Valhalla, and which is one of the quirkier enemies in Corruption, the Phase-ing. It's basically identical to the Inglets from Echoes, right down to the sound effects, except that it's made of Phazon. This suggests that Phazon somehow remembers every creature it's infected, but I really don't get that in this case, because the Ing in Echoes didn't show any signs of Phazon infection whatsoever. Also, if Phazon had access to the entire extended family of Ing, why the hell would it choose to mimic what is easily the single most pathetic Ing imaginable? Oh well. I guess the developers figured that single offhand reference to Planet Ether in a data log was a pretty lackluster way to tie Echoes into this game. Which it is, but honestly, so is this. But back to the more relevant point. As soon as you see Phazings, the game gives you the option of grabbing them with the grapple lasso. In the main game, you can then defeat them instantly by tearing them apart. But on Phaaze, this serves a much more useful purpose, using the grapple voltage to send Phazon energy surging into them, which not only kills them, but also has the fortunate side effect of substantially lowering your Phazon level, by about a third for each Phazing you do this to. I loved figuring this out on my own. The game never tells you to do it, but it does throw a lot of these enemies at you after each really difficult combat encounter on Phaaze, and it sort of trusts you to take the hint. It's subtle encounter design at its best. Maybe a little too subtle for me, actually, because in my first playthrough all those years ago, I never figured it out, which made getting through Phaaze way more frustrating for me. Another type of creature that's all over Phaaze is Metroids, which might seem a little weird at first. Metroids don't have any inherent connection with Phazon. They can be infected by it, sure, but so can everything else. To wrap your brain around this, you have to keep in mind that Dark Samus is essentially bonded with the source of Phazon. She's both controlling it and being controlled by it. And Dark Samus does have an important connection to Metroids, which is, the fact that she actually is one. This is a really clever way of bringing the themes of the Prime series full circle. At the end of the first game, Samus destroyed a Phazon-enhanced, super-powerful Metroid. And by the end of the trilogy, Metroids and Phazon have become practically indistinguishable, so that to destroy one is to destroy the other. You could say that Phazon is so destructive because it unleashes the inherent potential for violent aggression in whatever it infects. What could be more dangerous than for this substance to be combined with the ultimate bioengineered assault weapon? It's like poetry, It rhymes. But there's another way that the end of Corruption brings things full circle, and it has to do with the game's penultimate boss, Dark Samus, who's also arguably the final boss, since Aurora Unit 313 is just a puppet controlled by her. Back in 2002, when the first Metroid Prime came out, there was also another Metroid game released that, just like Corruption, went heavy on story and atmosphere, Metroid Fusion. The ultimate antagonist of that game was the SAX, an organism with all of Samus's powers, but without her humanity, a sort of evil parody of Samus, revealing all the potential dark sides of her power and abilities. I think Retro took at least some inspiration from this idea when they introduced Dark Samus in Echoes. Dark Samus lacks the SAX's mindless determination to replicate itself, but she carries on the idea of Samus's unique abilities being turned to dark and destructive ends. Echoes doesn't actually do much with this concept, but Corruption does, and here's how it does it: through the other bounty hunters that Samus faces over the course of the game. Rundas, Ghor, and Gandrayda all have at least one major personality facet in common with Samus. Rundas reflects Samus's curiosity and desire for adventure, the character traits that led her to become a bounty hunter in the first place. Ghor reflects the caution and diligence that make Samus an effective hunter. And Gandrayda reflects the adaptability and self-confidence that Samus was bound to develop as a result of her many successes. These are all positive traits, but it's not hard to imagine each of them turning negative if it was allowed to develop unchecked. Without a sense of moderation, curiosity can turn into restlessness and impatience. Caution can become fear and paranoia. And self-confidence can become arrogance and narcissism. Dark Samus is the sum of all of these negative qualities that grew up in Samus's shadow, as it were, which also makes her the sum of the corrupted hunters. It's not a coincidence that her specter hangs over each one of them as they pass through their final moments. In order to be more dramatic, the game also presents each successive corrupted hunter as being worse and more powerful than the one before. Rundas was a genuinely kind and helpful person before he was corrupted, while Gandrayda is shown to be rude and untrustworthy from the start, and Ghor is somewhere in the middle, not cruel, but also not particularly friendly or likable. All three of these characters are cautionary to Samus. They represent what she could easily become if she fails, another version of Dark Samus, another scourge to life across the galaxy. Almost every Metroid game that has had anything to say story-wise has had some variation on this theme of the dangers of power. Even Metroid Dread, despite all the problems I have with its story, strikes this chord pretty effectively. But I think Corruption does an even better job of making this point, and this is its greatest accomplishment. Which also explains why so many old-school Metroid fans don't like it. The game's greatest accomplishment has nothing to do with mechanics or level design, and this is what a lot of people expect out of a Metroid game. This is what I mean when I say that Corruption went hyper in its attempts to properly wrap up the trilogy. I believe that, sensing that story was the area that had the least attention paid to it in previous installments, the development team decided they would focus on story for the third installment, and use game mechanics and level design to help tell the story, instead of seeing them as ends in their own right. And there was a serious risk that, in pumping up the story to this extent, they would lose track of Metroid's heart and soul. For better or for worse, the classic Metroid game is not story-focused, and if it tells a story at all, it does so through subtle background details. Metroid Prime was a classic Metroid game, despite its three-dimensional world, but Echoes chafed against that framework, and Corruption practically disregarded it. If you're a Metroid purist, you have no reason to take Corruption seriously, because it just wasn't made with the same goal in mind as Super Metroid was. The team that made Corruption was ambitious, maybe more ambitious than any Metroid team ever had been, but their ambition wasn't to make the greatest classic Metroid ever, it was to tell an epic story within the Metroid universe. But all this raises a question. Should anybody actually be a Metroid purist? Or a purist about any game series, for that matter? Times and interests change, both for players and for developers, and as we grow, it's inevitable that we'll want different things out of the games we make and play. As a literary form, the trilogy is inherently incompatible with the idea of refining a single design concept to perfection. The beginning, middle, and end of a trilogy can't all be the same kind of story, because they have different roles to play in an overarching narrative. The only way for a game series to consistently appeal to the same interest across many different entries is for it to mimic the format of a comic strip, or a series of detective novels, or a long-running movie franchise like James Bond. Individual entries in this kind of series don't evolve or build on each other in any kind of consistent way. Instead, each one is just the newest incarnation of an old idea, dressed in this month's or this year's clothes. I'm not saying that these types of literature are necessarily inferior to other kinds. Honestly, in many cases, I'm a big fan of stuff that works like this, including video games. I'm on record disliking Breath of the Wild, even though it unquestionably innovates on Zelda more than any previous Zelda game has. I'd much rather have an iteration on my beloved old formula. And I don't have any more of a right to do that than Metroid fans have a right to expect Metroid games that put level design first and story second, or even lower. So I'm not saying that Metroid shouldn't work the way old-school Metroid fans want it to. What I am saying is that you can't expect that out of something that seriously calls itself a trilogy. For a while, I think Retro was on the side of the old fans, especially with Echoes, which was clearly uncomfortable with its role as the middle entry in an ongoing story. But by the time Corruption rolled around, Retro was engrossed by the story that was emerging from what they'd set up. And I'm not surprised. It's a great story, and one that actually suits Metroid extremely well, at least to the extent that any fleshed-out story actually does. It certainly says a lot more with a lot less than Other M, despite being made at around the same time. So that's the story of Metroid Prime, the trilogy that was and wasn't at the same time. But regardless of its trilogy status, it's one of the best-reviewed and best-loved game series in history, and I think it richly deserves the affection that it continues to inspire in players all over the world. Each installment has something different to offer, while also possessing that inner spark that reminds you it's something set apart from the rest of the industry. A lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to rank these three games, debating the finer points of boss encounters and combat mechanics and so on and so forth. I don't see much point in that, because honestly there's no reason to deny yourself the opportunity to play any of these games. They don't stack one on top of the other, instead they stand together as equals. The fact that some have a lot less replay value than the rest, or that some have graphics that are showing their age, or that some make you fight those goddamn Dark Pirate Commandos 20 mother-friggin' times, is no reason that you should pass them up. 10 out of 10. I'm serious. I give all of these games a 10 out of 10. They're amazing. Go play them right now any way you can. They're much more fun than listening to me yammer on for an hour and a half.